Most of us know the inspiring story of Rosa Parks, the African-American civil rights activist who refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. The bus boycott spurred by Parks' arrest would help bring down the racist laws of the Jim Crow South and turn a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. into the country's best-known civil rights leader. But we bet you didn't know that the story behind the bus boycott isn't quite as simple as it might seem. To start with, Rosa Parks wasn't the first black woman to resist bus segregation in Montgomery. In fact, several different women had been arrested for the same offense in the last 12 months. One of them was 15-year-old Claudette Colvin. On March 2nd, 1955, she was riding the bus home from high school when the driver demanded she give up her seat for a white woman. After Colvin refused, police officers arrived on the scene and dragged her off the bus in handcuffs. Claudette Colvin would go on to become one of 4 black female plaintiffs in Browder v. Gale, the Supreme Court case that would effectively end bus segregation. As a longtime volunteer in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and secretary to its president, Rosa Parks advised and supported Colvin. She knew that local black leaders had been thinking about how to confront bus segregation in Montgomery for years before 1955. She also knew they were looking for a test case, an upstanding citizen they could rally the community around. But Parks certainly didn't plan on becoming that test case herself until December 1st, 1955. At the wheel of the Cleveland Avenue bus that day was James Blake, the very same driver who had ordered Parks off his bus after a confrontation 12 years earlier. Parks was sitting in the middle section of the bus when Blake told her and 3 other black riders to stand up so that one white man could sit. The 3 other black riders moved, but she refused. Some people have said Parks was simply too exhausted from working a long day to move to the back of the bus, but she said later she wasn't physically tired, just tired of giving in to Jim Crow. The real story behind the Montgomery bus boycott may not be as simple as the myth, but it is no less powerful. The courageous resistance of Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin, and other ordinary women became the life force of the civil rights movement.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, earlier this year, the nation marked the 100th anniversary of the birth of Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a city bus in Alabama to a white man in December 1955. Her act of resistance led to a 13-month boycott, the Montgomery bus boycott, led by a young minister named Martin Luther King. In Washington, D.C. last month, President Obama presided over a ceremony unveiling a statue of Rosa Parks in the U.S. Capitol.
Rosa Parks' singular act of disobedience launched a movement. The tired feet of those who walked the dusty roads of Montgomery helped a nation see that to which it had once been blind. It is because of these men and women that I stand here today. It is because of them that our children grow up in a land more free and more fair, a land truer to its founding creed.
While Rosa Parks became a national civil rights icon, she was not the first woman in Montgomery to refuse to give up her seat on a city bus. On March 2nd, 1955, 9 months before Rosa Parks' arrest, a teenage schoolgirl named Claudette Colvin boarded a city bus after school to head home. As it filled up, a white woman was left standing, and the bus driver ordered the 15-year-old Colvin to get up and move to the back. She refused and was dragged off the bus in handcuffs. 3 weeks later, the New York Times ran an article headlined, "Negro Girl Convicted. She is held guilty of refusing to move to the back of the bus."
Claudette Colvin went on to become the star witness in a case that wound its way to the Supreme Court. The court eventually ordered an end to bus segregation in Alabama. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made his political debut fighting her arrest. Claudette Colvin joins us here in our studio now, 73 years old, living in the Bronx. And we're joined by Jean Theoharis, author of The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. Jean Theoharis is a professor of political science at Brooklyn College, has written extensively on the civil rights and Black Power movements, joined us in February on what would have been Rosa Parks' 100th birthday. Claudette Colvin. President Obama talked about Rosa Parks' singular act, but it wasn't exactly singular because you had done it before, 9 months before. She was 42. You were 15 years old. What gave you the courage that day? You were coming home from school?
Yes. What gave me the courage? All the unfair treatment that I had experienced in my early childhood. Plus, you remember February, we celebrated Negro History Week, but our school did it for the whole month. So I had a whole month to talk about all the injustices.
Back in 55.
Back in 55, yes. So I tell them, we had an instructor named Ms. Geraldine Nesby. She refused to teach English. She taught literature. And Mrs. Joseph Lawrence, my history teacher, she taught us about Africa. And we learned about, through current events, we learned about Africa. And so I began to think, about all of this and how unfair we was treated.
And when the bus driver called in the police, they accused you of resisting arrest as well as refusing to give up your seat. Could you talk about that and when the police came in to haul you off the bus?
One of the questions asked, why didn't you get up when the bus driver asked you and the policeman? I said I could not move because history had me glued to the seat. And they say, how is that? I say, because it felt like soldier on the truth, hands were pushing me down on one shoulder, and Harriet Tubman, hands were pushing me down on another shoulder. And I could not move. And I yelled out, it's my constitutional rights. Because I wasn't breaking the law under the state's law, separate but equal. I was sitting in the area that was reserved for black pensioners. At that time, we didn't want to be called black because black had a negative connotation. We were called colors. So I was sitting in the color section. But because of Jim Crow law, the bus driver had police force. He could ask you to get up. And the problem was that the white woman that was standing near me, she wasn't an elderly white woman. She was a young white woman. She had a whole seat to sit down by opposite me in the opposite row, but she refused to sit down because of Jim Crow laws. A white person couldn't sit opposite a colored person. And a white person had to sit in front of you. The purpose was to make white people feel superior and colored people feel inferior.
And this is something you clearly understood at the age of 15.
Oh, sure, because I didn't have to prepare for it. I learned it at a very early age. My first encounter was in a general store when a little white boy and a little white kid about my age and his friends, relatives, came into the store and they were laughing about me. And the little boy to another little child said, hold up your hands, let me see, let me see. And I held to my hands to his hand. And my mother gave me a backhand slap on the forehead.
And the context of what was happening at the time in terms of the terror on the black community, there was a schoolmate of yours who was arrested for supposedly raping a white woman who was then later executed?
Yes, his name was Jeremiah Rees. They had him arrested, but he was tried for being a serial rapist of 6 white women during the summer.
So the police come March 2nd,
Yes.
1955. You're refusing to get up. When they come on the bus, what do they do to you?
Well, they asked me to get up, and I refused. And one of the policemen was a traffic policeman. He at Court Square, and he yelled to the bus motorman that he had no jurisdiction here, and he got off. So the bus driver moved the bus to Building Commerce, and then 2 squad car policemen come on the bus. And I became more defiant. When they asked me the same question, and they yelled, "Gal, why are you sitting there?" I said, "It's my constitutional right. I pay my fare, it's my constitutional rights." And he said, "Constitutional rights," and then one kicked at me, and he knocked the books out of my hand, out of my lap. And then one grabbed one arm and one grabbed the other, and they manhandled me off the bus. And after I got in the squad car, they handcuffed me through the window and took me to booking, and then not to a juvenile facility, but to an adult jail. And I stayed in jail approximately 3 hours until my pastor, Reverend H.H. Johnson, and my mother came and bailed me out.
Were you afraid?
No, I wasn't afraid. I was a teenager.
You were in the NAACP?
Not at that time. I wasn't in it. When I got arrested, I was in. E.D. Nixon is like our Al Sharpton, and I was introduced. He introduced Mrs. Sparks to my family, and that's how I learned about Mrs. Sparks, through E.D. Nixon.
And he was president of the local NAACP, and she the secretary?
I don't know. I think he was in charge of the Pullman Porters.
Mm-hmm.
Ah.
And
the reaction of your parents, your family, to your arrest?
They knew about how I felt, because since Mrs. Joseph Lawrence was teaching us about Africa, I went to school with my hair in braids. And at that time, you had to do the best you could do with a hot comb and pomade. So I said, why put yourself through that trouble? So when I went to school like that, they said, "Oh, I was crazy, and that I would lose my boyfriend."
Ah. So this happened March 2nd, 1955. It would be 9 months before Rosa Parks would sit down on the bus and do exactly the same thing.
Yes.
That kicked off this kind of magic moment that kicks off the bus boycott. Why didn't that happen on March 2nd when you engaged in the same act?
I do not know. I wasn't. My parents wasn't involved in the MIA. I do not know.
The Montgomery Improvement Association.
Yes, I don't know, but they thought that I would not make a good test case. I know what was written in Taylor Branch's book, Part in the Waters, and what other attorneys have said, that later I became pregnant, but I was not pregnant on March the 2nd. And Mary Louise Smith Ware, they said her father was a drunk, alcoholic, but Mary Louise Smith went to a private school, St. Jude. She graduated from St. Jude.
And she was? Who was she?
She was only one of the plaintiffs. She was arrested in October.
Let's bring Jean Theo Harris into this conversation, who wrote the book this past year, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. Can you put Claudette Colvin's remarkably brave act, 15-year-old schoolgirl, into this larger political context? Why one action gets a lot of attention in Montgomery, but doesn't launch the boycott, and yet Rosa Parks does, and even the other young woman that Claudette Colvin was just talking about.
Right. So this is 1955. We're after the Brown decision. So this is a new legal moment.
Explain the Brown.
Brown versus Board of Education. It's May 1954. The Supreme Court rules that school segregation is illegal, that separate cannot be equal. Shortly after that, Joanne Robinson, she's a professor at Alabama State College. She's also the head of the Women's Political Council, writes a letter to the bus company saying, if you don't change, we're going to boycott. So we are in a new moment in Montgomery. There had been people before 1954 that had resisted on the bus. There had been particularly more people in the decades since World War II. But 1954, we're in a new moment. The Women's Political Council had been organizing. The NAACP, E.D. Nixon and Rosa Parks in particular are the more activist part of the NAACP. They are growing frustrated with the continuing situation, both on the bus and then in schools in Montgomery. So then, March 1955, Claudette Colvin makes her historic act, and there is outrage in the community. I think there's no way to understand why people galvanize behind Parks without understanding Colvin's arrest and what that does for many people in Montgomery. So no, we do not see a movement. We do not see, that same kind of reaction. But had Colvin not made that stand, I don't think we would have necessarily seen what happened in December of that year. And then, midway through in October, like we were talking about, Mary Louise Smith makes a similar stand. Again, there is no movement around that. And then we get to December 1st, 1955.
So in effect, then, these earlier incidents sort of convinced Parks and Dixon that at the time was ripe to make a symbolic stand, refusing the bus and to sit in the back of the bus, and then start the boycott as a result of that new arrest.
Yes, and there are these meetings of civil rights leaders over the summer with the city around bus segregation. Promises are made. Interestingly, Rosa Parks refuses to attend those meetings. She's done. She says, I'm not going to, come to city officials with a paper in hand asking for my rights. But other civil rights leaders in the community do meet with bus officials. There are promises made. The city makes promises. Those promises are not kept. So many people, again, in December, when Parks makes her stand, are also very aware that promises have been broken. And if you look at the leaflet that circulates, right, that calls for the one-day boycott, that leaflet very much locates Parks' stand in this broader history of Colvin's stand.
In fact, interestingly, the historian Douglas Brinkley has written that the delay between Claudette Colvin, our guest today, her act, and Parks' arrest, allowed Dr. Martin Luther King to emerge as a leader. He most likely would not have led the bus boycott if it had occurred in the spring after Claudette Colvin's arrest, instead of the following winter. Brinkley writes, he might have ended up as just another Montgomery preacher. We're going to hear what King has to say after break. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. On these last days of Women's History Month, we're joined by a woman who made history, Claudette Colvin. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.
Those front seats. Y'all better make it light on yourselves and let me have those seats. Are you gonna move?
No.
If you don't give me that seat, I'm gonna have you arrested.
You may do that.
Dispatch, driver James Blake. Listen, I got a colored woman on my bus in violation of the law.
Did you warn her, Jim?
Yes, sir, I warned her.
Well, then you just do it. You gotta exercise your powers and put her off.
All right, man, I'm gonna need police backup.
Grandpa, I think I hate white people.
Only thing you need to remember is that you're as good as anybody else. White, black, or green with stripes. Don't ever be afraid of what can happen to you. If you're fighting for what's right. As long as you keep that with you, then hate will be a word for other people.
Sitting in the colored section.
I needed that seat, and she wouldn't move. I want her arrested.
Why won't you stand up?
Why do you all push us around?
Will you listen to that?
The law is the law. Lady, you're under arrest.
Now to one of the most memorable Americans ever to confront the issue of racial segregation head-on in this country, 40 years ago. Rosa Parks, who in refusing to give up her seat on a city bus to a white man became the Mother Superior of the Civil Rights Movement. This week, at the age of 82, she's traveling this country with a group of students, her story and what she is telling them in her own words tonight.
I remember well these struggles that we went through during my childhood when the Ku Klux Klan was very active. It just made us stronger to continue the struggle for freedom. This was the seat that I took as I got on the bus. A few white people boarded the bus, and one man was left standing. And I certainly did not plan to stand up, and I didn't consider myself breaking the law because I was in what was supposed to be our part of the bus. So my arrest brought about a protest from the people of Montgomery that lasted 381 days. And when we did go back on the bus, we didn't. The Supreme Court had handed down a decision that they would be no more racial segregation in transportation. When I was on the bus the time I was arrested, the only thing that was on my mind was that I did not want to be treated in that way.
It took her sitting down to get a people to stand up. And we can never, ever, ever forget her for that.
That happened to Rosa Parks in 1955. Just one more reminder that the happy-go-lucky 50s were not at all what they seem to be in the rose-colored glasses of our memories.
Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Thurgood Marshall. These are all names of African Americans you may be familiar with. They were very important in the fight for civil rights and the end of segregation. But in every fight, there are people in the background who organize, inspire, work on the details, train volunteers, and think of new ways to move their cause forward. Ella Baker is one of those people. Ella Jo Baker was born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1903. Listening to stories told by her grandmother, who had been an African American held in slavery, Ella developed a feeling for the injustice of segregation and racism. Her grandmother had been whipped for refusing to marry a man her owner had chosen for her. Ella attended Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was a bright student and did well in school. Even in college, when she felt a school rule was unfair, she fought to change it. After graduation, she moved to New York City and began joining social change organizations. She was a social advocate. A social advocate is someone who sees unfairness in society and works to change the problem. Ella joined the Young Negroes Cooperative League, whose purpose was to strengthen African American economic power. She also joined women's organizations. She was dedicated to justice and equality for all people. Ella began her involvement with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, in 1940. She traveled the southern United States promoting civil rights and inspiring African Americans to be strong in their fight for fair treatment. Ella believed in the power of the people to make change, that simple African American citizens have the ability to make great things happen if they work together. In North Carolina in 1960, after a group of black college students refused to leave a white-only lunch counter, Ella was inspired. She organized the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Using the same idea that Mahatma Gandhi used in his fight for freedom, the students protested unfair treatment in nonviolent ways. Marches, protests, and activities like the Freedom Rides were organized by the SNCC. Because of her ability to lead and inspire, she was given the nickname Fundi, a Swahili word meaning a person who teaches a craft or skill to the next generation. Ella died in 1986 at the age of 83. Her work behind the scenes during the struggle for civil rights helped move the cause forward. Her actions changed the future for African Americans in the United States.
Hi, I'm Neil Bumgartner, one of the facilitators here at the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. We're going to share some of the stories of the people whose lives are commemorated on the Cloud of Witnesses here in the museum. This Cloud of Witnesses contains the images and names of various martyrs from the Civil Rights era. It's by no means a full collection of everybody who gave their lives, but it does provide an opportunity for us to discuss different individuals who made a great sacrifice to gain civil rights in this country. We want to share these stories to provide a little bit of insight into the effects of Jim Crow, of racism, and of the hatred that gripped this country for so long.
I woke up this morning with my man who said I would be I woke up this morning with my man.
On June 21st, 1964, at the beginning of what was to be known as Freedom Summer, three civil rights workers, Michael Henry Schwerner, James Earl Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, lost their lives to Klan violence in what would be a case that gained national attention for the past 40 years. A couple weeks prior to their death, on Memorial Day in 1964, Schwerner and Chaney had arranged to set up a freedom school at Mount Zion Church in nearby Longdale. Klan members, thinking that they were going to find Schwerner and Chaney at a business meeting at the church, surrounded the church, beat some of the church members, and burned the church. Unfortunately for the Klan, Schwerner and Chaney were not there at the time. They were actually in Ohio at a national conference that was teaching people how to take part in this Freedom Summer program. When word got to Ohio, Schwerner and Chaney jumped in their Corps car and headed back down to Mississippi along with Andrew Goodman, who they had just recruited to come and help. As they were heading back to the Corps office in Meridian, they were pulled over and arrested by Neshoba County Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price, who happened to be a member of the local Klan. Deputy Price jailed the three civil rights workers, and while they were in jail, he contacted Edgar Ray Killen. The details of exactly what happened that afternoon are unclear. What was clear is that around 10 p.m., the three young men were released from jail. As they departed from the county jail in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and drove back towards Meridian, they were once again pulled over by Deputy Price along with two carloads of Klansmen. The three men were put into the police car, driven to a remote location, and when they were driven to that location, Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman were both killed by close-range shots fired by Klansman Wayne Roberts. James Earl Chaney was savagely beaten and tortured prior to him being killed. The Klansmen took their bodies and buried them in an earthen dam on another Klansman's property, where the bodies lay undiscovered for 6 weeks. The disappearance of the three men was highly controversial in the area. Some Mississippi legislators and powers thought that it was all a hoax.
Jim, we got 3 kids missing down there. What can I do about it?
Well, I don't know. I don't believe there's 3 missing. Now, I'm going to tell you why I don't think there's a damn thing to it. They were put in jail in Philadelphia, in East Mississippi, right next to John Stennis's home county. And they were going to Meridian. There's not a Ku Klux Klan in that area. There's not a citizens council in that area. There's no organized white man in that area. So that's why I think it's a publicity stunt.
I believe them jokers planned and sitting off up there in New York laughing at us Mississippi folks.
Well, I believe it's a big publicity hoax, but if they're dead, I feel like they asked for it.
6 weeks later, when they did find the bodies, it was confirmed that these 3 young men had been murdered, had been brutally murdered, and their bodies had been disposed of.
Yes, Mr. President. They found those 3 bodies 6 miles southwest of Philadelphia, Mississippi. 6 miles west from where they last seen. They don't know that these are the bodies. They moved them into Jackson to identify them. They're off Route 21. It's right near the site of a new dam that's been built. They have every reason to believe they are the bodies. So call the families and tell them that there'll be an announcement in the next 10 or 15 minutes. And we'll, as soon as we get proper identification, let them know further.
Despite all of the evidence that was gained during the investigation, the state of Mississippi refused to press any murder charges against any of the perpetrators of the crime. 3 years later, in 1967, the federal government pressed charges against 18 individuals for violating the civil rights of Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman. There was no federal murder statute under which to try the men who had killed them, so this was the best that they could do. After a trial, 7 men, including Deputy Price, and Sam Bowers, the Imperial Wizard, who had ordered Schwerner's elimination, and Wayne Roberts, who had been the triggerman that killed Schwerner and Goodman, were found guilty. 7 others were acquitted. 1, the charges were all dropped. And 3, there was a hung jury, including for Edgar Ray Killen, with one of the holdout jurors saying she could never convict a preacher. After the trial, the judge, who was also a known segregationist, said that they killed 1 nigger, 1 Jew, and a white guy. I gave them all what I thought they deserved. The memory of the killings and what happened in Mississippi haunted the members of the communities in Neshoba County and the greater area of Mississippi for over 40 years. People were seeking justice. As a small measure of justice, in 2005, 41 years after the murders, Edgar Ray Killen was finally tried, convicted, and sentenced to 3 20-year sentences for the killings of Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman. To this date, he is the only perpetrator of the crimes who was convicted or even tried of any murder charges in the killing.
The roadside, I cried alone, all by myself. I cried alone by myself. I stood on the roadside and cried alone by myself. I stood on the roadside and cried alone by myself. And there's no way for me to get along. I was wanting some train to come along and take me away from here. Friend, take me away from here. Some train come along and take me away from here. And there's no way for me to get along.
The testimony before the Credentials Committee, the FDP had a lineup of very different people. They had Rita Schwerner, the widow of Mickey, who had been killed in Neshoba County. They had Martin Luther King. Everybody knew King.
The seating of the delegation from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party has political and moral significance far beyond the borders of Mississippi are the halls of this convention.
But the highlight of the testimony was that of Fannie Lou Hamer. The sharecropper who had been evicted from her plantation had come to symbolize the Mississippi movement.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, it was the 31st of August in 1962 that 18 of us traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse in Indianola to try to register to become first-class citizens. We was met in Indianola by policemen.
The president, Lyndon Johnson, he's not afraid of Martin Luther King's testimony. He's afraid of Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony. And so he decides that the country should not see her testify live.
Johnson is in the White House, and he convened an impromptu press conference.
We will return to this scene in Atlantic City, but now we switch to the White House and NBC's Robert Goralski.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
On this day, 9 months ago.
He did it knowing that they would break away, thinking he might announce who his choice of vice president was going to be. Instead, he gets up there and he announces, get this, he announces that it's 9 months to the day since Governor Connolly, who was there, was shot along with President Kennedy. So he announced a 9-month anniversary. Everybody's scratching their heads.
Thank you very much.
And then he leaves. And by that time, Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony was over. However, it backfired on Johnson because it became a story that she had been taken off television and in the news that night, and for days afterwards, they replayed her testimony.
I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to place us in cells.
She had Mississippi in her bones. Martin Luther King or the SNCC field secretaries, they couldn't do what Fannie Lou Hamer did. They couldn't be a sharecropper and express what it meant, right? And that's what Fannie Lou Hamer did.
And it wasn't too long before 3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was a state highway patrol. He said, "We're going to make you wish you was dead."
In June of 2005, city officials dedicated a display in tribute to the life of one of the most prominent figures in the history of our country's civil rights movement. His name was Roy Wilkins. The commemorative mural is now part of a building that was renamed in his honor in 1984, the Roy Wilkins Auditorium, part of the River Center complex. Wilkins was born in 1901 in St. Louis, Missouri, the grandson of Mississippi slaves. After the death of his mother, Roy and his brother and sister were sent to live with an aunt and uncle in St. Paul. It was here in the Rondo neighborhood that the legacy of Roy Wilkins began. He had fond memories of St. Paul. As a child, Roy played with white and black children and attended an integrated school. This upbringing deeply influenced him, as he later wrote in his autobiography. At first, color doesn't mean very much to little children, black or white. Only as they grow older and absorb poisons from adults does color begin to blind them. Blacks and whites alike are susceptible to this sad change. In 1923, he graduated with a sociology degree from the University of Minnesota and worked as a journalist, writing and editing for the Minnesota Daily and newspapers with a black readership, like the St. Paul Appeal and the Kansas City Call. From 1931 to 1977, Wilkins was active in the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He served as executive secretary of the organization from 1955 to 1977, overseeing 250,000 members during some of the most tumultuous years of the civil rights movement. Often called the father of civil rights, Wilkins took part in the civil rights marches of the 60s and helped pass landmark pieces of legislation, including the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and the Civil Rights Act. He was an advisor to 4 U.S. presidents, working especially closely with Lyndon Johnson, who awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1967. Another monument to Roy Wilkins is found on the grounds of our state capitol. Artist Curtis Patterson made 46 obelisks rising from the ground and spiraling outward to represent each year that Wilkins worked with the NAACP. As civil rights achievements grew through the years, so did the pillars, ultimately breaking through the walls representing the barriers of racial segregation. Roy Wilkins died in 1981. The part he played in the struggle to gain civil rights for all people is remembered for his persistence and hard work, always accomplishing his goals through peaceful and legal means.
If there is one thing I resolved from the courthouse burning, it was that never would I be like those in the mob. Never would I hate another human being so much that I would kill him and me, even if it takes years longer, even if the highways are not always wide and smooth. I pray that I shall never crawl toward the promised land on the belly of my spirit. The humanity common to all men transcends race, nationality, and color.
The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is the largest civil rights organization in the United States. For the past 20 years, through the most turbulent times of the civil rights movement, the NAACP has been led by Roy Wilkins. Through dedication and courageous effort, Wilkins and the association have had a lasting impact on contemporary American history. The NAACP was founded in 1909, half a century after the Civil War ended slavery as an institution. But most blacks were still victims of poverty, discrimination, and racial hatred. In many states, laws kept blacks from the housing, schools, jobs, and voting rights that were available to whites. The association was founded on a daring notion that full integration of the races was a necessary and desirable goal. Through the many years of hardship in the struggle for racial equality, the NAACP has maintained its dedication to the theory of integration.
The NAACP is dedicated to the no discrimination between citizens of the United States, black and white, and all in between. In the original call to form the NAACP in 1909, there was this phrase: recent history in the South shows that in forging chains for the Negroes, the white voters are forging chains for themselves.
Roy Wilkins has been a steadfast and courageous part of that proud history. He has stood firm in times of vacillation and has been a voice for calm.
Clarence Mitchell, head of the NAACP's Washington office. No one has been closer to civil rights legislation over the past 3 decades. Sometimes called the 51st Senator, he is a longtime friend of Roy Wilkins.
I first met Roy Wilkins in the 1930s, at which time there were many horrible things happening in the United States, and there were not many people who were standing up and talking out against such things as lynching and various forms of segregation and discrimination. But Roy Wilkins was out there in front at that time as a newspaper editor in Kansas City, Missouri, in the Kansas City Call. He later joined the NAACP, but I would characterize him as a man of great courage, a lot of common sense, and a sense of destiny in knowing that he wanted to go to a certain place, he wanted to bring his people to a certain place, and he seemed to have a sense of certainty about doing what he was setting out to do.
Roy Wilkins was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1901. His mother died when he was only 5 years old, and he and his brother and sister went to live with an aunt and uncle in St. Paul, Minnesota. He grew up in a community with only a handful of blacks. He attended mostly white public schools and spent his time mostly with white friends. Wilkins was an excellent student, and from early on his writing was powerful and clear. When he went to the University of Minnesota in 1919, he joined the staff of the student daily newspaper. After graduating, Wilkins owned and edited a black newspaper in Kansas City, Missouri. He stayed there until he joined the staff of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1931. Since then, he has had an influence on virtually every major step forward of the civil rights movement. In his leadership, he has avoided exaggeration and showmanship, but he has always been powerfully effective.
When Roy Wilkins joined the NAACP in 1931, It must be remembered that this was 2 years after the Great Depression had descended on this country. There was tremendous unemployment among blacks, far, far higher proportionately than among whites in the country. There was also a tendency to try to blame the blacks for various kinds of things that were happening. It wasn't necessary for an individual actually to commit a crime. All he had to do was be suspected, and he could be lynched. The theory was that you could maintain a special place for black people, a special place for white people. This would satisfy the Constitution of the United States. That was a spurious doctrine, but it had a great power in those days. For example, all of the public schools of the South and in some cities of the North were segregated on the basis of race. Roy Wilkins was a part of the team, which was made up of Walter White, who was then the secretary of the NAACP, Roy Wilkins, and Thurgood Marshall, who is now a justice of the United States Supreme Court. It was their objective to try to eradicate these kinds of unjust things.
In 1948, there was a sharp upward revision in the way black people felt that they would come out. Nothing hopeful, but an improvement over what had been.
The post-war period left us with a lot of unemployment in this country. It left us with returning military people who had been off fighting a war for democracy. And it was very clear that those who had been fighting for human justice around the world were in no mood to come back to their own country and find such things as segregation based on race. It was then that the NAACP, which had been following a program of attacking segregation on a kind of piecemeal basis, decided that there had to be a frontal attack on the so-called separate but equal doctrine.
It would take a landmark decision by the United States Supreme Court to overturn the laws that kept black children separate from white children in schools. Roy Wilkins worked with Thurgood Marshall and other NAACP lawyers to devise a strategy for a Supreme Court test. They enlisted expert witnesses who testified about the psychological and social harm of segregation to black children. They argued that racial segregation in the schools violated the United States Constitution. On May 17, 1954, the court handed down a momentous decision. In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The NAACP had been instrumental in winning the most significant civil rights victory since the end of slavery.
As far as the impact of the decision, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, had, it simply meant that the system under which thousands and thousands of Negroes had been educated prior to that time was dumped out the window. And there could no law be passed that my children could go to this school, and if I were white, they could go to that school.
The 1954 decision spurred the NAACP and other activist groups to challenge segregation in housing, transportation, and public facilities. Marches and sit-ins led to the arrest of many demonstrators. Roy Wilkins became executive director of the NAACP in 1955, and it was clear that there was much work yet to do. To gain true equality, not only the laws, but the attitudes and traditions of segregation had to be overcome.
When Roy Wilkins assumed the leadership of the NAACP, the full impact of the Supreme Court school desegregation decision was felt. Unfortunately, there were many people, high government officials in the state, who mobilized a virtual arsenal of types of frustration to try to prevent that decision from being implemented. We had the scene of a governor of one state, the governor of the state of Arkansas, using the armed forces of that state to prevent black children from going to public schools. Roy Wilkins, at the helm of the NAACP, had to meet and deal with all of those problems.
The story was getting across to America and to the world that the Negro was a human being, was an American citizen, presumably possessing inalienable rights which were being grievously and bestially violated, that the proud and free America could hardly hold its head high enough to escape the stench. Did we have courts? And to what end? Did we have a constitution? For whom? What of our vaunted slogan, equal justice under law?
In the period of the 60s, there was a great awareness on the part of blacks that by using their political power, they could elect officials to public office who would be sympathetic to their cause. This resulted in enormous participation in presidential and local elections by blacks, and it also brought into the White House a man who had the reputation of being very concerned about human rights and individuals. That, of course, was President John Kennedy. Around that type of thing, there grew a belief that something dramatic had to be done to spark up the actions that were already underway in the Congress to try to get certain kinds of legislation passed. It was A. Philip Randolph, one of the elder statesmen among the blacks, Martin Luther King, Roy Wilkins, and others from the religious community, from labor and other places, who got together and hit upon the idea of having what was called a march to Washington.
In 1963, the NAACP helped organize and staff history's largest protest against inequality. 250,000 people, black and white, came to Washington to tell the American Congress that it must pass laws prohibiting discrimination against blacks.
We felt that it was going to be a flop. And we were afraid that it was going to be, you know how people are. But we went ahead and came out. We came out about noon, and the people were flocking down there.
The March on Washington went far beyond everyone's hopes, and it offered a forum for one of the most eloquent speeches the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King ever made.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
I don't think anybody will ever recover the feeling, that the universal feeling that came out of the March on Washington.
The March on Washington in 1963 led eventually to the passage of many laws breaking down segregation and inequality in employment, voting, and housing.
In the 1960s, it was important to have a framework in which to operate. Roy Wilkins supplied that framework. I believe it was a very simple one. He pointed out that the Constitution of the United States sanctioned the use of activities such as picketing and such as demonstrations. He pointed out that the people had a right to petition their government for redress. He also pointed out that there were times when you had to have direct confrontation in order to challenge injustice. These were principles that the NAACP had always espoused and had used successfully in challenging a lot of injustices, but now it had to be done on a monumental scale throughout the country.
It was the NAACP lawyers who went to court to protect the rights of demonstrators. The NAACP often paid bail money and fines for those who were arrested and jailed in civil rights demonstrations. And NAACP members filled the ranks of marchers and demonstrators. Roy Wilkins traveled to Jackson, Mississippi in 1963 to join Medgar Evers, a field secretary of the NAACP. Evers was organizing a protest against stores refusing to hire blacks. 12 days later, an assassin killed Medgar Evers.
In his hands, he's got the big round word.
I went down with Medgar Evers to protest the denial of employment by Woolworth stores. It was only 12 days before he was slated to go. He gave me a modus operandi for dealing with white folks. He said, now there's a policeman on this corner, and there's policemen in the rear, and the thing to do is not to be any different than the people on the street. Therefore, you must conceal the signs.
Roy Wilkins was arrested that day in Jackson. His philosophy of leadership stressed responsible, nonviolent action. And within the framework of the Constitution, confrontation could be justified. After 20 years of active leadership of the NAACP, Roy Wilkins retired. His successor, lawyer, banker, minister, Benjamin L. Hooks.
The NAACP will not go into eclipse because Mr. Wilkins has resigned. In fact, he's still contributing his talents and time as director emeritus, and I look to him for advice and some comfort in these difficult days. And when Ben Hooks leaves, NAACP, it will not die because it is an organization of 1,700 chapters, almost 500,000 dues-paying members, and a spiritual kind of kinship that's very difficult to define.
Roy Wilkins has had a lifelong dream to see the burden of segregation and inequality lifted from his people and his country.
We will work harder to secure our rights to decent education, jobs, and equal protection of the laws. Let us use every tool at our disposal, every hand on deck, black and white, young and old. There is unfinished business for us to take care of.